All right, ready when you are.
Okay. I'd like to share an experience with you that for me has been emotionally distressing. At times it was physically battering. And that experience was learning how to land an airplane. Now I've provided this handout to all of the tables just so you can see what kind of plane I'm talking about, and maybe it'll help you relate a little better. You can see there's two wheels in the back, and that's called the main gear. When you're landing a plane, you want to hit those two wheels on the runway, definitely not the first. I'm just going to paste this up here. Use it to demonstrate what I'm talking about. Now just a very brief introduction to landing an airplane. There's a lot that goes into it, but I can just focus on a couple aspects of it. You typically want to pull the power out, have the propeller just be idle, so it's producing no power. You glide on into the runway. Just before you get to the runway, you pull up a bit. This is called the flare. This allows for the angle of the airplane to change, and it allows you to land on those back wheels that we're talking about. So on my first lesson, they actually let me land the airplane on my own the first lesson. And I didn't really know just how the angle needed to be, so we're gliding in to the runway, head straight on. And I decided, well, I probably don't need to pull it that much. It's always very small adjustments they're talking about. And my path looks a bit like this. At this path, the weight of the airplane came down on the nose gear, not the back ones like I was talking about before. Little did I know this nose gear acts as a giant spring, and as it hit, the nose of the airplane came up. I'm sitting there holding on for dear life, we're starting to flip backwards. Luckily, the instructor brought it back in just fine. He looked at me once we finally got settled, rearranged the cockpit back to how it was, and said, well, try not to do that again. Well, the second attempt at landing, I decided, okay, well, I don't want to make the same mistake. That was pretty traumatic. So I'm gonna change my approach. I'm gonna try to pull up quite a bit more and flare aggressively, as you would call it. And my approach looked a bit like this. You know, it's going pretty well as it's coming down here. But the plane has quite a bit of speed in its gliding in. It's coming in about 65, 70 knots if you're doing it correctly. And if you pull up too hard, it's got enough speed and momentum that it's going to go ahead and just start climbing back into the air on you, even though the engine's off. There are limitations to how long it can do this. As you can see, the line ends here. At this point, the plane runs out of speed, momentum. Most importantly, it runs out of lift, and it comes crashing back to the ground. There was one plus. I landed on the main gear, but it was a 15-foot drop. I left my back in tatters. The instructor never complained. I guess they go through this a lot. I proceeded to make this same exact kind of landing 20 times in a row. I could not get the feel for this. And I can't tell you how frustrating at about $300 to $400 a lesson that ended up being. So eventually I was physically in pain. I ended up in a bathtub full of ice, contemplating my decisions. And I was also feeling a little bit of a failure at this point. I mean, how after doing something 20 times can you not figure out how to do it and make the same exact mistake every single time? I was not very happy with myself. I decided to take a few weeks off, take a step back, and go ahead and try to regroup a little bit. My instructor also sent me an article on a technique on how he learned to land. And I don't know why it took him 20 times of these horrendous landings for him to say, maybe I'll give him the article now. But he has his own ways, I suppose. So I read this article, I took the step back. 3 weeks later, I returned to the airport. We're gliding into the runway, just like we did before. And I start thinking about all of the things that I've done, the mistakes I've made, and how I was going to correct it this time. So we get very close to the ground, and I flare. I pull up. I pull up too hard again, and I feel the nose come up too high. And this time I just pushed it down a little bit. And as the nose came back down, it got a little too low. And I pulled it back up, and then I pushed it down and up and down. And that ended up looking a lot like that. And when the airplane finally ran out of speed, momentum, and lift, it dropped about 2 inches from the air, and it hit the asphalt, and the wheels had this just perfect squeal that you hope to get when you perfect a landing. I then went around 3 more times. I did the same landing 3 times in a row. At that point, the instructor told me I should taxi the plane over to the little corner of the airport. And he opened the door and he said, "Well, I don't think you need me anymore." And he got out of the plane, and I had my first solo on that day. Now, the experience was definitely humbling, but it reminded me of a few things. It had been years since I'd tried something new. I've been in economics and finance for so long. You never push your boundaries. And it really relates to public speaking quite a bit, because both of these topics are things that do not come naturally to most people. But if you put in the work and you finally get to the goal you're trying to accomplish, it's that much more rewarding. Thanks for your time. Questions?
Are you currently taking? Do you use it for? Is it a hobby now that you fly planes?
Definitely a hobby. You're actually able to fly the plane without an instructor before you get your license. So I'm going through a few solo maneuvers, and hopefully I'll get the license in a couple months. So cross my fingers on it.
Is this something you've always wanted to do, or just a spur of the moment? Let's go try to fly a plane.
No, since I was probably 3 years old, I've just been fascinated with aviation. And I finally had the time, and more importantly, the money. And I decided I was going to go after it. Alexis?
What kind of a plane do you fly when you're taking your lessons?
It's that plane exactly. It's the Cessna 172, it's a Skyhawk, and it's very common in training. It allows you to get a private certificate. Not all training planes allow you to go that route. But from there, you can also build off it. You can get instrument ratings. You can get a seaplane rating, the ones with pontoons. That's ultimately what I hope to end up doing, because that was really what got me involved when I was young.
Where do you take the lessons from?
It's out at Leesburg Airport. It's in Virginia.
So avoid that airport for a while.
I'm flying Delta.
We do have to avoid the Dulles Airlines. They come in right over us, so we have to stay
Oh.
just below them.
Wow.
That's tricky. Okay. Well, thanks for your time.
Okay, feedback for Kyle.
I thought the visual aids were effective in the use of hand gestures. Were appropriate.
I like the story, the personal story. That was nice.
In that, a lot of people today did speeches that were not stories, and I know that I'm a better storyteller than information deliverer. So I don't know if I cheated a little bit, but I definitely stayed with what I was comfortable with. Some of the other ones I would have found more challenging.
If you're good at that, some folks are not good storytellers, but if you're good at that, use that, because it does paint those pictures that people can relate to. How many of you have flown an airplane? Or let's put it, how many of you have flown in a small airplane? Okay, so a fair amount of you How many of you have actually had the opportunity to try and land that small airplane?
I'm just glad to get out of the plane.
Yeah, so it's not something anybody here can relate to. So being able to tell that story, at least you get a sense of what that must be like.
I did have to think just how much groundwork I'd have to lay before I could get into it, and that you have to set it up.
There are a couple other ways you could do it. You could maybe say, how many of you learned to drive a car? And maybe do an analogy of something if you want to try and get folks to relate to it. But I don't know, was it effective? Could you sort of feel yourself there?
Yeah, I felt myself crashing. I didn't even crash. So, especially the 20th time I bit the tub full of ice. I was like, oh, I'm hurt, and I'm not hurt. So, it was definitely effective.
Yeah, and to admit defeat.
Right.
Times.
Yeah.
I never admit defeat.
Me,
Let
that a
alone
lot.
20 times.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I landed that the first time.
Yeah. I got
Nice
no
fish
third
story.
try.
Yeah.
I like this story. It was kind of a little bit like the story of like the bears and porridge, like a little too hot, a little too cold, and then the story. So yeah, I thought that was very relatable. I think we've all gone through something where we're being challenged, and then finally are able to overcome that challenge. With the visual, one preference of mine would have been to keep all three lines up there when you go through the different stories. So first it's to love, and it's high, and it's just right, but in different colors. But yeah, I thought it was overall.
That would have been a good idea.
She sounds like it.
I echo that. I put a note down there. That's what Tufty would say to do. And do 3 different colors. And kind of get this comparison. You see the difference.
I would say one of your strengths is your sense of humor, your dry sense of humor, you know? So I don't know how you can incorporate that all the time, but I think that's one of the things you can use to your benefit, in addition to those stories.
Okay.
I don't think you did bad following Tasha.
I don't think so either. You did great.